ready to roll. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is how nothing is real and anything is possible these days. For better or for worse, we're living in times when we can really conjure the environment around us. And of course, this quote by Chris Roper that I found on Twitter really sums up a lot of the things that I've been thinking about lately. And that is, like God's deepfakes don't have to be real to have an impact. All that is required is that somebody believes in them. And that is really pertinent for a lot of the things going on in the world, not just in the technological space, but also in the economic and the political space.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind. Good night.
Some of you may know who that is. That's Richard Nixon. The only thing is that that speech never happened. Somebody has decided to rewrite history by putting words into a real historical figure's mouth. And what this really does is it means that increasingly we are becoming lost in the endless present as human beings, as businesses, as societies. This is because our past is becoming falsifiable. If evidence that is both visual and audio-based and text-based can all be manipulated, what does that mean for future generations? Just this week, we had, of course, the Holocaust Remembrance Week. What happens then when that is forgotten, when those last survivors pass on, and when someone is able to re-edit all of that footage that we saw of the horrors that took place in Auschwitz? And what this means is as we look forward to our future, we also seeming to have a narrower and narrower horizon of how far ahead we're planning because our everyday lives are becoming all that more overwhelming. And what this also speaks to is the fact that increasingly George Orwell is proving to become right, in that there are no true facts anymore. In fact, increasingly, truth is finding itself on the wrong side of history. There are a whole lot of things we're not allowed to say, even though we might know that they are true, because they are no longer parts of the politically correct discourse of the day. Even taking these words directly from Orwell's text from 1984, we can see something as war as peace. As ridiculous as that sounds, that is something that we are being told and asked to believe going on right now today. We're being asked to believe that war in the Middle East is necessary for people in America to have peace. We are also being asked to question the question of freedom versus slavery. We are asked to believe that it is necessary to have our personal freedoms and privacies reduced in order to have more freedom to walk around unmolested in our streets through things like more and more ubiquitous surveillance and more attention to the everyday movements that we make in and through our lives. And this really gets us to question our sanity. Of course, scientists aren't of too much help in this regard. Quantum physicists and cognitive neuroscientists will both tell us that what you see and what I see when we look at the world around us is not entirely exactly the same. We all bring our own biases, our own nuances to every single instance. And that really means that finding common ground, finding middle ground, which is something that Dion's going to talk about a bit more later, becomes all that more difficult when perhaps there are no real facts that we can fall back on and all agree on. And that brings me back to that key theme that I also am looking at quite deeply at the moment, the theme of belief. And this is from one of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett. Belief is one of the most powerful organic forces in the multiverse. It may not be able to move mountains exactly, but it can create someone who can. And this is quite a profound quote. It explains a lot that's gone on in the world, both in the past and the present, with things like religion. Doesn't necessarily mean that that particular God really does exist, but if you can get people to believe in that God, you can get people to do any amount of unusual and perhaps crazy things in the name of that belief. Another example of this trend is this trend towards what I'm calling fantasy economics, and there's quite a lot of ways we can look at that. One way to look at that is how we are increasingly decoupling value and worth from the real and physical world. By this, I'm talking about things like literal fantasy economics that's going on in Venezuela at the moment. As we all know, they're having a bit of an economic crisis over there. And what people are doing, because people are very good at making a plan when life doesn't exactly go to their plan, is that they can't make money in the real world. They're turning to games to make money there, which means that some people in Venezuela are literally mining virtual digital gold in gaming environments and then trading it with other gamers for real world currency. Now, before you go off and do this yourself, it's not that easy to get very rich off it. You can only earn a couple of $100 a week doing it. But it still got to the point where other gamers outside of Venezuela have actually started creating gaming assassin teams to go after the Venezuelan mining cartels within the gaming universe. So we start to see how our concept of value is being untethered from the real world. And all of this requires for us to believe that these things in the virtual world do have real worth in order for them to actually have worth. That's the magic of regular economics too, when you think about it. The money that we use today is mainly electronic and it's not really backed by anything either, but it works because we believe in it. In a similar vein, this dress that you see on the screen behind me is a virtual garment. It doesn't really exist. It only exists as a Snapchat or Instagram filter. But someone was prepared to pay $9,500 for this imaginary dress so that they could look really good in their selfies. If that price point is a bit too rich for you, there's a company in London that will sell you virtual jeans to wear on your online photographs for the low, low price of £200. So affordable, but perhaps not necessarily the best investment. But it really does speak to the fact that the virtual world is increasingly having real world worth once again. And Dion and I look quite a lot at trends, at Flux Trends, and we've also seen that amongst Generation Z, that's younger teenagers here in South Africa, increasingly young people are spending their real-world pocket money on virtual skins for their gaming characters in games such as Fortnite. And it's not something happening on the fringes. We've had conversations with many parents where we've seen this is becoming a real trend. And this, of course, begs the question as to whether Kurzweil or Donella Meadows really has the right idea about limits to growth. Because of course, Kurzweil is famous for the singularity and his abundance mentality, where he says that as technology progresses, we are able to have infinite abundance for everyone. Donella Meadows, of course, takes exactly the counter view, and she wrote the famous book, Limits to Growth, because she was talking about the fact that sustainability is an issue here on planet Earth, and that we are going to run out eventually of both natural resources and sinks. That's places to put our trash, whether that's trash we're putting into the sea or carbon that we're putting into the air. And when we start questioning virtual economics, we start to see that the truth is probably somewhere between their two paths, because if economic worth is decoupled from our natural resources, there's no reason, as long as we of course believe in the worth of these virtual goods, that we can't build towers of worth from pretty much nothing, really, in the virtual space. Of course, just a quick caveat there is a real cost to the virtual world too. Many of you last year might have seen the robot hand that solved the Rubik's Cube. Now, that little action required something like 2.8 gigawatts of electricity. For those of you who grew up in the 80s, like myself, you might remember Back to the Future and the fact that Marty and Doc only required 1.21 gigawatts of electricity to go back in time. That sort of shows you exactly how much power is required to power the virtual world at this point. But that's not to say that we're going to necessarily have exactly the same constraints that we have currently with worth based on the physical planet. But of course, it's not just wealth that's being decoupled from reality. We're also seeing a decoupling of people, that's human beings, from reality. Now, as a trend analyst and a futurist, if you want to see the future, a good place to start is with the world of sex. Of course, sex was related to the very first profession in the world, and Pornhub at the moment is doing some quite interesting things. So to continue on the sustainability conversation, this is a picture from their dirtiest movie ever made, and it was made as a reaction to sea pollution. They actually shot a porno on this beach. But that's not really why I want to talk to you about Pornhub today. Rather, it's because this industry is where deepfakes came from. The first deepfakes were celebrities put into compromising positions by some young men on the internet. And in fact, even still today, something like 98% of deepfakes are still fetish related. So if we want to see the future trajectory, of course, it's always good to see where it started. But it doesn't just carry on from there. We're also getting to the point where you can create your own deepfakes. So you can take one single still image, like you can see with DALL-E over here on the screen, and you can turn it into a living or lifelike deepfake. This means that the fetishists that were originally making, say, deepfake pornos of their favorite celebrities could take your Facebook picture and make you do things with them that you wouldn't necessarily want to do with them in real life. Now, that might be a bit concerning to you, but perhaps more concerning to me from a societal level is what's going on with now the creation of artificial people. Once again, a decoupling of the real world with our real needs. So this is Samsung Neon, and they at CES this year, they got a lot of press for their neon virtual people that you see on the screen. These are imaginary people designed to be the perfect girlfriend, friend, assistant, or just general companion. And what some of my fellow futurists are questioning is that when these virtual people, coupled with artificial intelligence, start to interact with us and fulfill our needs and desires, increasingly they will be more beneficial to fulfilling our needs than real people around us. Real people could be quite lame because they'd argue with us and not do what we want. And increasingly we start to spend more and more time with these virtual beings than we do with our physical worlds. Once again, if you go back to parents, we're seeing how young people are getting sucked into virtual reality worlds through gaming environments and are finding that perhaps more fulfilling than their personal lives with real-world interactions. To go back to Fortnite, the other trend that we've tracked is that young people, instead of going out to a physical place to interact with their friends from school, are rather logging onto a gaming environment and interacting with those same people in a virtual space. So once again, it's quite a big trend, this decoupling of real-world relationships into the virtual world. So to continue on the idea of virtual reality and how it's taking over everything, this is not a joke, this really is going on in Russia at the moment. Russian farmers have started installing virtual reality headsets on their cows in order to calm the cows down, make the cows feel happier, feel like they're in rolling fields rather than a small pen, so they produce better quality milk and tastier meat at the end of the day. And I found this quite profound because increasingly what we are seeing as futurists that are looking at trends going on in the world is that for more and more people, it's becoming more and more attractive to escape into a virtual reality, especially when we get to the point when we can start to design our very own utopias and spend as much as possible of our waking lives in those virtual environments. Now, this is not as futuristic as it sounds. It doesn't mean that you have to log on to a game and enact your life through your character. It can also mean that you can start to increasingly put filters on your real-world environment, either looking through augmented reality lenses on your cell phone camera, or even when we start getting to things like smart glasses and smart contact lenses, it's possible to spend more and more time in an engineered environment that has less and less in common with the real world around us, should we choose to do that. And of course, there are many reasons why we might want to do that. Why virtual reality could really become an opiate for the masses, the next sort of wave of what television was prophesied to become in the mid-century, last century. So to come back to reality with a bit of a bump, we are in Africa, and it definitely bears talking about what's going on in Africa and what are some of the things that people might want to escape to rather go to a perfect virtual space where they can have anything they want, be anything they want, without actually having to struggle through the day-to-day challenges of being an adult. We all know adulting is quite hard. And when it comes to Africa, we're in the midst of quite a disturbing trend at the moment. Across the world, poverty has declined to a negligible amount, everywhere except for sub-Saharan Africa, where poverty is actually increasing. And now you compound this really distressing trend with the fact that by mid-century, 1 in 4 people in the world is going to be African, and most of those Africans are going to be sub-Saharan Africans. At the same time, places like Our World in Data are predicting that something like 500 million of those people are going to be in abject poverty. So that means we're faced with current crises, and current crises encourage us to once again focus on the infinite now, on dealing with the urgent, not looking ahead to the important. And that means that we're stuck in a cycle of reacting and not being proactive. And that also means that we're at a risk of falling further behind the progress going on in other places that might have the luxury to look ahead. Sociologists say that societies that are dealing with imminent crises, things like violence against women and poverty and crime and social distress, lose track of their stories. The stories are the narratives that tie societies together from one generation to the next, that enable us to look ahead at big projects, like going back to Nixon and the moon landing that did go right. That was a big project that people pulled together because we had the luxury to look forward, and we gave ourselves the space and time to plan ahead and not just be victims of the future, but actually directors of it. At the same time, though, Africa is not the only place that is in a bit of trouble at the moment. What we're increasingly seeing in the Western world is that people have less and less faith in the future. Now, this is a bit different to what's going on in Africa, where people are forced to deal with crises that are coming up at them. Rather, what people in the West are feeling is that this is as good as it's going to get. And the term for this is PROSTELGIA. It means that you're kind of longing for a present to carry on in the same place because the future looks like it could be worse off for you, not better for you. And when people are anxious about the future, we stop dreaming about the future. And this is something that I've definitely noticed from my line of work, in that 100 years ago, we were planning things at the World Fair. We were envisaging life in 2000, life in 2100 years' time. But today, how often do we speak about the year 2100? How far ahead are our timelines? I don't see many people talking about anything past the year 2030. That seems to be our next horizon. So horizons have shrunk. At the same time, we're losing our past to perhaps fake news and degradation of the truth. We're also losing our future because we are no longer planning for it. And that means that we're increasingly stuck in this perpetual now, which is for me quite a distressing trend and is not very hopeful. And I think there's a lot to be hopeful about, because in general there's never been a better time to be born. Lifespans have never been longer, health has never been better, gender equality has never been better from a global perspective. All the major trends are in general ticking upwards. So we have reason to be optimistic. But at the same time, it does require us to be proactive and start directing for that, towards that future that we want to live in. And that's why today I want to encourage you to, instead of being stuck in the immediate and the instantaneous and the perpetual now, we should rather start looking at the long now. Now, the long now is quite a beautiful concept. It refers to the entire human lifespan that your life will touch over the course of your life. So it means that it takes into account the living memory of the oldest person alive in your society. And in South Africa, from what I've been able to see, it's a man by the name of Frans Blum, who lives in Cape Town, and he's about 115 years old, which means that he would have been alive when the ANC was formed over 100 years ago. And that's how the long now extends into the past. The long now, of course, also extends into the future. And that extends into the future memory or the future lifespan of the youngest living person in your society. That's the babies that are born today that can expect to live for 110 years. Because that's kind of what we're looking at now as we start to cure more and more illnesses. That's quite a feasible lifespan to look forward to. When we start orientating ourselves in that much longer now, we're able to learn from the mistakes of the past and take the best of our past stories forward with us to orientate us into a more directed, more proactive future as we go forward. And then when we start looking ahead to the long now, we also start to make more conscious decisions about sustainability, because now we're not just optimizing what we can get out of our own lifespan, getting what we want now, getting what we need now, and don't worry about it, the children will pay for it later. Like Herbert Hoover said, blessed are the young, for they shall inherit the national debt. And that makes a lot of sense if you are stuck in the now and you're only concerned with your own lifespan. However, if you start thinking about that next 100 years, we start to make more conscious choices about not polluting the planet, about thinking more directly about economic policies and how they're going to be, are they going to be equitable, are they going to be fair, are they going to be sustainable? Because those are the lives that each and every one of us are going to touch, going back into the past and going forward into the future. And that's what I want to leave you with today. Basically, the future needs you. It needs more people thinking about it and taking that long view. Thank you.